So we just looked at what Augustine said about his episode with the pear tree and how that episode really encapsulates a lot of Augustine's thinking about a variety of important issues about evil, about why we sin, about the role of friendship. I want to say just a little bit more about a couple of those issues before kind of wrapping up the Confessions. First, note that when Augustine talks about evil and sin, there are two related issues. One you might call the metaphysical question, that question of if God is good and God created everything, how or why is there evil? That question he again answers by talking about evil as the diminishment of the good. So we can go, there are examples throughout the book, but one is on page 50. This is paragraph 12. The trouble was that I knew nothing else. I did not recognize the other true reality. I was being subtly maneuvered into accepting the views of those stupid deceivers by the questions they constantly asked me about the origin of evil, and whether God was confined to a material form with hair and nails, and whether people who practiced polygamy, killed human beings, and offered animal sacrifices could be considered righteous. Being ignorant of these matters, I was very disturbed by the questions, and supposed that I was approaching the truth when I was in fact moving away from it. Here's the key line. I did not know that evil is nothing but the diminishment of good to the point where nothing at all is left. How could I see that, I whose power of sight was restricted to seeing material shapes with my eyes and imaginary forms with my mind? So again, in his phase where he sees everything as material and has a dualistic view of the universe, Augustine says, I don't know how evil could exist and not be a product of God. But once he realizes that God is spirit, that God creates everything, he can then think about evil as simply the diminishment of the good. Again, that turn away from the good, the absence of good. There are lots of ways to talk about that, and that helps him with his metaphysical question. He also then wants to think about evil and sin as a human experience. Right? He wants to think about the dynamics that humans undergo. Because part of what Augustine found in his own experience as we read the book is that he came to a point where he knew what was good, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but he couldn't get himself to do the good. Or to put it the other way, he knew things were evil, but he couldn't stop doing them, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. And he talks a lot about feeling himself divided. That's the personal experience of evil question. Why are we so bound to things we don't want to be bound to? For Augustine, that's a huge question. And he describes this on page 144. He's talking about the problem of the human will. And in listening to a story of someone who had converted, he said, I ached for a like chance myself, for it was no iron chain imposed by anyone else that fettered me, but the iron of my own will. The enemy had my power of willing in his clutches, and from it had forged a chain to bind me. The truth is that disordered lust springs from a perverted will. When lust is pandered to, a habit is formed. When the habit is not checked, it hardens into compulsion. These were like interlocking rings, forming what I have described as a chain, and my harsh servitude used it to keep me under duress. And then a paragraph later, he says, I thus came to understand from my own experience what I had read, how the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit drives against the flesh. I was aligned with both, but more with the desires I approved of myself than those which I frowned upon. For in these latter I was not really the agents, since for the most part I was enduring them against my will rather than acting freely. All the same, the force of habit that fought against me had grown fiercer by my own doing, because I had come willingly to this point where I had not wished to be. So what Augustine describes is a type of habituation, how we turn from the good and then start doing things that are evil. and they become habits, and then they become compulsions. And even when you get to the point that you know that they're wrong, you're still compelled to do them by the force of habit. For Augustine, it's a kind of slavery, of being enslaved to things you don't want to be enslaved to, but you've given yourself over to them time and time again, so they become what you do. For Augustine, this becomes his ultimate issue. He comes to the point where he knows the truth, but he still can't do it. This leads then to something kind of startling in Augustine's Confessions, which is that in some ways he intellectually converts to Christianity by the end of Book 7. He believes in the Christian God, he believes in Jesus, he believes in sin, he believes all of it. And yet, he's not converted. He doesn't really consider himself a Christian. He's not ready to be baptized. He's not willing to live the kind of life he thinks he needs to live. So you can see at the end of Book 7 what he says. In awe-inspiring ways, these truths were striking deep roots within me as I read the least of your apostles. I contemplated your works and was filled with dread. He knows the truth, and it terrifies him. It's only after his experience, again in a garden, lots of gardens in this book, in a garden, reading a book, that Augustine has a conversion. He said, I had no wish to read further, nor was there need. No sooner had I reached the end of verse than the light of certainty flooded my heart, and all dark shades of doubt fled away. What changed for him was the grace of God, that he had this moment of having a certainty that was not just an intellectual certainty, but a change of his will, the change of what he wanted, the change of his desires. He senses it coming from without. He doesn't do it on his own. It's from God. And it doesn't change his mind. It changes his desires. It changes his will. And that's finally for Augustine when he is converted and when he is ready to follow what he sees to be the Christian life. I want to talk just one more time about Augustine on friendship. Note how many people are central to his conversion. This isn't a solitary quest. Part of what can make reading this book a little frustrating is that there are all these names, and you think, why do I need to know all these names? Well, in part because for Augustine, they show the import of the community, of the people who help him along his way, and Augustine wants to do that same thing in his book for the people reading it. So people central to his conversion. Bishop Ambrose, who helps explain to him the Bible. This is a really interesting passage where he says, I had thought that I had to read the Bible in this really literal way, and Ambrose showed me that I don't have to, that there is a spiritual interpretation, that kind of interpretation, the allegorical interpretation we talked about. Parenthetically, also a really interesting note on Ambrose. Augustine is really struck that Ambrose reads silently, which indicates that when most people read, they read aloud. He thinks it's very odd that Ambrose sits there and reads silently. Interesting. His mother, Monica, this woman who is constantly praying for him and helping him and wanting him to become a Christian. The story of Simplicanus, the story of Alpius, or his friendship with Alpius. All of which is to say that Augustine isn't opposed to friendship or wanting to be friends with people. He isn't opposed to loving your friends. He's opposed to two things. Having the wrong kind of friends, friends who lead you away from God. And then he's opposed to making your friends your God. When he talks about his kind of overwrought grief, one of the ways that at least some scholars have read that is to say Augustine sees his problem in those cases not as being sad that his friend is gone, but as someone who has made this friend basically a god, has asked this friend to perform a function the friend can't. That Augustine, when you get too enmeshed in other people, you stop allowing those people to be who they are, and you then just become all about making them who you need them to be. And part of what Augustine seems to be suggesting here is that when he learns to love people in light of God, he can love them for who they are and not just based on what he feels like he needs them to be. He's finding his needs taken care of in God, and that allows him to have some freedom and just loving his friends. So it's not that grief is bad. It's that if you're grieving because you have made this other person your God, or have made this person something that the person could never be, then you're going to grieve incorrectly because you loved incorrectly. All right, finally, what's on offer? Why do people read this book? What's useful about it? Well, I think we can think about this as, again, Augustine making us some offers, not because you're necessarily going to agree with Augustine's ideas, but because he's a profound thinker who saw the world in a particular way. And when you encounter people who see the world in a particular way, it allows you to say, how do I see the world? Do I agree with this person? If I don't, why don't I agree with this person? How do I think about this? It helps us not to just assume that the way we see the world is the way everyone has. It gives us a moment of self-reflection. So first, you can think about Augustine's theological ideas. He has thoughts about how God is. He has thoughts about what evil is. I think it's worth sort of thinking, are these compelling to you? If they're not, and they don't have to be, why not? What don't you find compelling? Augustine's anthropology, his analysis of what's wrong with humanity, I think it's worth thinking about. Are we created for ends? Are we created? Is that a word to be used for us, right? Is there something external to us that is created to us? Or are we really kind of responsible for creating ourselves? Those are two very different views of humanity, right? If there is a God who has created me, then part of what I need to do is figure out the purpose for which I was created and align with that. If I'm simply the accumulation of mechanical forces or chemical forces, then I might have a certain other set of questions that I ask about my life. So it's worth thinking about that. I do want to note here, I'm not trying to make a distinction between whether or not you accept the evolution or not accept evolution. That you can, and many people who agree with Augustine and all sorts of things accept evolution. That doesn't take away the believing that you have a purpose point. So this isn't a question about evolution or not evolution. It's a question about, are we created by a God who has a purpose for us or not? And then finally, the view of as reality is held by God. Augustine was able to do the kind of really thorough self-examination he did because he believed he was held by God. That's maybe not the way you see the world, but I think Augustine asks you then, okay, so why don't you? If you do see the world that way, then Augustine might be asking you, and how's your self-examination going? Do you ask yourself hard questions? Do you really allow yourself to investigate your own deepest desires and flaws because you know yourself so held? So there are reasons to read Augustine. He asks us questions. He invites us to think about the answers to these questions. They may not be the answers he comes up with, but they are questions that he posed that then allow us some time to think. Okay, in the next video, we go to the Augustine you're probably not going to like. So I want to just say one more time to the Augustine that maybe I've wooed you into thinking, if maybe, I don't care if you think he's right, but has something worth saying. All of this then goes back to Augustine believing that we have a creator and that our purpose is to return to that creator from whom we have turned, to return, to take our restless hearts and have them rest in the creator. In the next section, we'll talk about a piece of Augustine's thinking that you may or may not find quite so compelling.